What happens when a country music superstar walks onto a late-night talk show expecting a friendly chat and instead finds himself in the crosshairs of one of television's most ruthless interviewers? Blake Shelton thought he knew what he was signing up for when he agreed to appear on Real Time, but nothing could have prepared him for the verbal ambush that was about to unfold. This wasn't just an uncomfortable interview. This was a complete meltdown that ended with security escorting one of America's most beloved entertainers off the set while cameras were still rolling. Before we get into exactly what Bill Maher said that pushed Blake over the edge, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us whose side you're on in this explosive. Confrontation, the green room, had been perfectly pleasant. Blake had been joking with the producers, sipping on bottled water, running through some light talking, points about his new album and his latest season coaching on The Voice. Everything seemed routine, almost boring in its predictability. But the moment he walked through those curtains and settled into the guest chair, he noticed something different in Bill's eyes. There was a glint there, something predatory that Blake had seen before in the eyes of journalists, who were more interested in creating headlines than having conversations. Bill opened with what seemed like a softball question about Blake's music, asking him about the evolution of country music and whether he thought the genre had strayed too far from its roots. Blake gave his standard answer about respecting tradition while embracing innovation, talking about how country music had always been about storytelling and connecting with regular people. He was comfortable, smiling, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. That's when Bill pivoted. Without warning, without any transition, he brought up Blake's background, his Oklahoma roots, and then, in that casual, almost friendly tone that Bill uses when he's about to strike, he asked Blake about his political views, not in a general sense, but specific pointed questions about issues that Bill knew would put Blake in an impossible position. Blake tried to deflect, giving the kind of diplomatic non-answer that celebrities are trained to deliver, saying he preferred to keep his political beliefs private and let his music speak for itself. But Bill wasn't having it. He leaned forward in his chair, that famous smirk spreading across his face, and said something that made the entire studio audience go silent. He suggested that Blake's reluctance to speak on political issues was itself a political statement, that his silence was a form of complicity. He brought up Blake's massive fan base in red states, implied that Blake was afraid to alienate them by being honest about his views, and then, in what felt like a calculated move to provoke a reaction, he made a dismissive comment about country music fans in general. Blake's jaw tightened. You could see it happening in real time, the way his whole demeanor shifted from friendly guest to someone who was seriously considering walking off the set right then and there. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and said calmly that he didn't appreciate Bill making assumptions about him or his fans. That the people who listen to his music are smart, thoughtful individuals who don't need a celebrity to tell them how to think. The audience applauded, which seemed to irritate Bill even more. He responded by doubling down, suggesting that Blake's defensive reaction proved his point, that anyone who got upset about being asked to take a stance on important issues was probably on the wrong side of history anyway. He said it with a laugh, like it was all just part of the show, just friendly banter between host and guest. But everyone in that studio could feel the temperature rising. Blake leaned back in his chair and asked Bill a simple question. He wanted to know why Bill had invited him on the show, if the plan all along was to ambush him with political gotcha questions instead of talking about music. He pointed out that Bill's show was supposed to be about open dialogue and different perspectives, but it seemed like Bill only wanted to hear people agree with his own viewpoint. The comment landed hard because it was true, and several people in the audience murmured in agreement. Bill's response was to laugh it off and say that if Blake couldn't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't be doing interviews at all. He suggested that Blake was used to the softball treatment he got on morning shows and entertainment programs, and that Real Time was a place for adults to have real conversations. The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and you could see Blake's hands gripping the arms of his chair a little tighter. That's when Blake made his first real mistake. He fired back, telling Bill that there was a difference between tough questions and deliberately trying to make your guest look bad for entertainment value. He said that Bill had built a career on smugness and superiority, on making people feel stupid for not sharing his exact worldview, and that it wasn't journalism, it was just bullying with a bigger vocabulary. The studio went completely silent. Even Bill seemed momentarily taken aback by the directness of the attack. But Bill recovered quickly. He's been doing this too long to let a guest get the upper hand for more than a few seconds. He came back with a comment about how interesting it was that Blake was so sensitive about being challenged, suggesting that maybe Blake's image as a laid-back, easygoing guy was just that, an image, and that underneath it all, he was just another thin-skinned celebrity who couldn't handle criticism. He said it with that characteristic Bill Maher delivery, part joke, part insult, designed to make Blake look unreasonable for being upset. Blake shook his head, slowly, and said something that surprised everyone. He told Bill that he'd been warned about coming on this show, that other people in the industry had told him that Bill liked to set traps for guests who didn't fit his political profile. But Blake had ignored those warnings because he thought he was being invited for a genuine conversation. Now he realized he'd been naive. He said he felt like he was sitting in a courtroom being cross-examined for crimes he hadn't committed, and that this wasn't an interview, it was an interrogation. The audience was completely divided at this point. Some people were applauding Blake for standing up for himself. Others were cheering for Bill, and the energy in the room was becoming genuinely hostile. Bill tried to regain control by making a joke, saying something about how Blake was being dramatic and that if this felt like an interrogation, Blake must live a very sheltered life. The comment was meant to get a laugh and diffuse the tension, but instead it had the opposite effect. Blake stood up, not quickly, not in a dramatic storming off kind of way, but slowly, deliberately, like he'd made a decision and was going to follow through with it, calmly and with dignity. He looked directly at Bill and said that he'd come on this show as a guest, not as a target, and that he wasn't going to sit there and be insulted for another 30 minutes just so Bill could get some viral clips for social media. He said he had too much respect for himself and for his fans to participate in whatever this had become. Bill immediately tried to backtrack, telling Blake to sit down, that they were just having a conversation, that Blake was overreacting. But there was something in Bill's voice now, a hint of panic, because he knew this was going sideways fast, and that a guest walking off mid-interview would make him look bad, make it look like he'd lost control of his own show. He appealed to Blake's professionalism, reminded him that they were live, that walking off would be unprofessional and childish. Responded by saying that what was unprofessional was inviting someone on your show under false pretenses just to ambush them with political questions that had nothing to do with why they'd agreed to appear in the first place. He said Bill could spin it however he wanted. But Blake knew the difference between a real conversation and a setup, and this was definitely a setup. He thanked the audience for their time and started to walk toward the exit. That's when Bill made his biggest mistake of the night. Instead of letting Blake leave with some dignity intact, instead of trying to smooth things over or apologize, or even just moving on to the next segment, Bill called after him. And what he said next would be the comment that would dominate headlines for weeks. Bill raised his voice so everyone in the studio could hear and said that this was exactly what he'd expected from someone who'd built a career pandering to the lowest common denominator. He said Blake could walk off the set, but he couldn't walk away from the fact that his entire brand was built on appealing to people who'd rather live in ignorance than face uncomfortable truths. The words hung in the air like poison, and Blake stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment, nobody moved. The cameras were still rolling, the audience was holding its collective breath, and Blake was standing there with his back to Bill, clearly deciding whether to keep walking or turn around and respond. When he finally turned back, his face was calm, but his eyes were ice cold. He walked back toward the desk, not to his chair, but right up to where Bill was sitting, close enough that the host instinctively leaned back slightly. Blake spoke quietly, but the microphones picked up every word. He told Bill that he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He said Bill could insult him all day long, could question his politics or his intelligence or anything else about him personally. But the moment Bill insulted the millions of people who supported his music, who came to his concerts, who connected with his songs, that was when this stopped being about two guys having a disagreement and became something else. Entirely, Bill tried to interrupt, tried to clarify that he wasn't attacking Blake's fans, but Blake cut him off. He pointed out that Bill had just called them the lowest common denominator, had implied they were ignorant, and that there was no way to spin that into something innocent. Blake said those people Bill was so quick to dismiss were teachers and nurses and construction workers and veterans and parents, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. They were real people with real lives who didn't deserve to be looked down on by someone who lived in a bubble and made millions of dollars, being condescending for a living. The audience erupted. Some people were on their feet applauding, others were booing, and the whole studio had descended into chaos. Bill was trying to regain control, gesturing for people to quiet down, but it wasn't working. He turned to Blake and accused him of grandstanding, of playing to the crowd instead of engaging with the actual substance of what they'd been discussing. He said Blake was hiding behind his fans instead of defending his own positions. Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it. He asked Bill what positions he was supposed to be defending. Since Bill had never actually asked him about any specific policy or issue in good faith, he said every question had been designed to make him look stupid or backwards or complicit in something, and that Bill had made up his mind about who Blake was before Blake had even sat down. Blake said this whole thing had been theater, a performance where Bill got to play the smart, enlightened host taking down the ignorant country singer, and that he was done playing his assigned role. Bill's face was getting red now. He told Blake that if he wanted to be treated like an intellectual, maybe he should stop acting like a victim every time someone challenged his worldview. He said the problem with people like Blake was that they wanted all the benefits of being famous, all the money and adulation and platform, but they didn't want any of the responsibility that came with it. They didn't want to be held accountable for their influence or questioned. About how they used it, Blake asked Bill who'd appointed him the accountability police. He wanted to know what gave Bill the right to decide who was using their platform responsibly and who wasn't. Blake pointed out that Bill spent every show telling other people how to think, what to believe, who to vote for, and then had the nerve to accuse other celebrities of abusing their influence. He said at least Blake was honest about staying in his lane and making music, while Bill pretended his opinions were somehow more valid or important than everyone else's, just because he had a talk show. The conversation had completely spiraled beyond anything resembling a normal interview. This was a full-scale argument now, and both men had clearly forgotten they were on television. Bill accused Blake of anti-intellectualism, of being proud of not engaging with complex issues, of representing a strain of American culture that celebrated ignorance and distrusted expertise. He said country music had always had a problem with this, with glorifying simple living to the point where it became an excuse for not thinking critically about the world. Blake's response was surgical. He told Bill that there was a difference between simple living and simple thinking, and that Bill's inability to understand that difference was exactly why he had such contempt for people who lived differently than he did. Blake said some of the smartest, most thoughtful people he'd ever met were folks Bill would probably dismiss as uneducated or unsophisticated, just because they didn't share his coastal elite perspective. He said real intelligence meant being able to understand and respect different ways of seeing the world, not just assuming everyone who disagreed with you was stupid. Bill shot back that Blake was confusing respect for different perspectives with acceptance of dangerous ideas. He said there were real stakes to these conversations, real consequences to the political and cultural divides in the country, and that celebrities who refused to take clear positions were contributing to those divides. He accused Blake of taking the coward's way out, of wanting to profit from both sides without having the courage to stand for anything. That word, coward, seemed to hit Blake differently than anything else that had been said. His whole body language changed. He leaned forward and told Bill very clearly that he'd served his country, that he'd put himself in dangerous situations doing USO tours in war zones to perform for troops, that he'd used his platform to raise millions of dollars for disaster relief in children's hospitals and veterans organizations, all without making it about his own ego or political agenda. He said he didn't need lectures about courage from someone whose biggest risk in life was whether his monologue jokes would land. Bill looked genuinely stung by that. He fired back that charity work didn't absolve anyone from taking moral positions on important issues, that writing a check wasn't the same as actually standing for something. He said Blake could volunteer and donate all he wanted, but if he stayed silent when it mattered, when his voice could actually make a difference in public discourse, then what was the point of having that voice at all? Blake asked Bill if he'd ever considered that maybe Just maybe, not every single person with a platform wanted to use it the way Bill thought they should. He said there was value in artists who just focused on their art, who tried to bring people together through music or entertainment instead of driving them further apart with political commentary. He suggested that maybe the country would be better off if fewer celebrities felt obligated to weigh in on every single issue and more of them just tried to create things that made people's lives a little better or more bearable. Bill dismissed this immediately. He said that position was a luxury only available to people who weren't directly affected by political decisions, that it was privilege masquerading as neutrality. He told Blake that his ability to opt out of political discourse was itself a form of privilege, and that his refusal to use his platform was a choice that had consequences whether Blake wanted to acknowledge them or not. The argument kept escalating, with neither man willing to back down or concede any ground. Blake accused Bill of thinking everyone needed to be an activist, of not understanding that people had different roles to play in society, and that not everyone needed to be a political commentator. Bill accused Blake of hiding behind folksy charm and country boy authenticity to avoid taking responsibility for his influence. They talked over each other, interrupted each other, and the moderators and producers had clearly lost any ability to steer this back toward something resembling a normal interview. Then Bill made another critical error. He brought up Blake's divorce, his past relationships, and suggested that maybe Blake's reluctance to talk about his values had something to do with not wanting people to look too closely at his personal life. It was a cheap shot, and everyone knew it. The audience gasped, and even some of Bill's usual supporters in the crowd seemed uncomfortable with where this had gone. Blake went very still. He stared at Bill for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with barely contained anger. He told Bill that his personal life was off limits, that they'd agreed before the show that certain topics wouldn't be discussed, and that Bill had just broken that agreement in front of millions of people. He said if Bill wanted to attack his politics or his intelligence or his career choices, fine. But bringing his family and personal relationships into this was crossing a line that couldn't be crossed. Bill tried to justify it, saying that personal behavior reflected values, and that values were relevant to their discussion, but Blake wasn't buying it. He said Bill was grasping at straws, trying to hurt him personally because he was losing the argument on substance. Blake told Bill he was a bully, pure and simple, someone who used his intelligence and his platform to make other people feel small, and that this whole interview had been designed from the start to humiliate him. The producers were now visibly trying to signal for a commercial break, but Bill waved him off. The two men were now standing face to face, and the tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Bill told Blake that he was acting like a child, throwing a tantrum because someone had the audacity to treat him like an adult instead of a celebrity who needed to be coddled. Blake responded that Bill wouldn't know how to treat someone like an adult because his entire career was built on talking down to people, on assuming he was the smartest person in every room and everyone else was there to be educated by his superior wisdom. Bill's voice rose as he accused Blake of being unable to handle criticism because he'd spent his whole career surrounded by yes-men and fans who worshipped him. He said Blake had probably never had a real intellectual challenge in his life, never had to defend his ideas in any meaningful way, and that's why he was falling apart now when faced with actual scrutiny. Blake shot back that Bill had never had to perform in front of hostile crowds, never had to win over people who started out hating him, never had to work for an audience's respect instead of just preaching to people who already agreed with him. The argument had devolved completely. They weren't even talking about politics or values anymore. They were just attacking each other personally, trying to land verbal blows that would hurt. Bill called Blake a fraud, someone who'd cultivated an image as an everyman while living a Hollywood lifestyle. Blake called Bill a hypocrite who railed against elitism while being one of the most elitist people on television. The audience didn't know whether to cheer or boo, and the energy in the room was becoming genuinely uncomfortable. That's when things got physical. Not violently, but Blake reached out and poked Bill in the chest while making a point. Just a single finger jab to emphasize what he was saying. Bill immediately recoiled and accused Blake of assaulting him. Blake laughed in disbelief and said that a poke wasn't assault, that Bill was being ridiculous and trying to make himself into a victim now that he was losing the argument. Bill called for security, actually called for security on his own show, and told them to remove Blake from the set immediately. Blake couldn't believe what was happening. He stood there, arms spread wide, asking the security guards who were approaching if they were seriously going to escort him out for a poke on the chest. He told them this was insane, that Bill had spent the last 40 minutes insulting him and his fans and his personal life, and now Bill was having him removed for barely touching him. The security guards looked uncomfortable, clearly not wanting to be part of this mess, but they had their orders. Bill was pointing at Blake and telling security to get him out, that Blake was being aggressive and threatening. Blake turned to the audience and asked them if they'd seen anything aggressive or threatening in what just happened. A significant portion of the audience shouted no, that Bill was overreacting, but Bill ignored them. He told the cameras that this was what happened when celebrities weren't used to being held accountable. They resorted to intimidation and aggression. Blake was escorted toward the exit by 2 security guards, who were trying to be as gentle as possible about the whole thing. As they walked him out, Blake called back to Bill and told him that this would be the last interview Bill ever ambushed someone in, that people would see this footage and understand exactly what kind of show Bill was running. He said Bill had just exposed himself in front of everyone, and that no amount of spin or editing would change what had happened here tonight. Bill yelled back that Blake could tell himself whatever story he needed to feel better. But the truth was that Blake had come on the show unprepared to defend his positions, and had melted down when pressed on basic questions. He said this was a perfect example of anti-intellectual culture, of people who valued feelings over facts and personal comfort over honest discourse. Blake stopped at the exit and turned back one more time, telling Bill that the only person having a meltdown was Bill himself, and that everyone watching could see it. The security guards finally got Blake through the exit doors, but even from backstage, you could hear him still arguing, his voice carrying back into the studio. Bill tried to compose himself, tried to address the camera and explain what had just happened, but his hands were shaking and his voice was unsteady. He told the audience that he'd tried to have a real conversation, and Blake had proven incapable of handling it, that this was unfortunately what happened when you invited people outside your usual bubble onto the show, but the audience wasn't buying it. There were boos mixed with the applause, and several people were shouting that Bill had gone too far, that he'd been unfair and deliberately provocative. Bill tried to quiet them down, tried to move on to his next segment, but the energy was completely gone. His other guests looked uncomfortable, unsure whether they even wanted to continue with the show after what they'd just witnessed. Bill took a commercial break, but the damage was done. Backstage, Blake was still furious. Producers were trying to calm him down, apologizing profusely and saying that things had gotten out of hand, that this wasn't what they'd intended. Blake told them he didn't care what they'd intended, that Bill had crossed every line possible, and they'd just sat there and let it happen. He said he'd been set up, ambushed on live television, and then physically removed from the set for having the audacity to stand up for himself. One of the senior producers tried to explain that Bill could be difficult sometimes, that he got carried away when he was passionate about a topic, but Blake cut him off. He said this wasn't about passion, this was about a host who got off on humiliating his guests, who invited people on specifically to tear them down in front of an audience. Blake told them they should be ashamed of themselves for facilitating it, for creating an environment where that kind of behavior was acceptable. Meanwhile, back in the studio, Bill was trying to salvage what was left of the show. He brought out his remaining guests and attempted to have normal conversations with them, but everything felt flat and awkward after what had just happened. The guests gave cautious answers, clearly not wanting to become Bill's next target, and the audience remained divided and restless throughout the rest of the taping. When the show finally ended, Bill left the stage without his usual goodbye to the audience. He went straight to his dressing room and refused to talk to anyone from his staff. The producers gathered for an emergency meeting to discuss damage control. Knowing that footage of the confrontation would be everywhere within hours, they debated whether to try to edit it down or just release everything and let people judge for themselves, ultimately deciding that trying to hide anything would make them look worse. Blake left the studio without talking to any press, without making any statements, just got in his car and drove away. But his team was already fielding calls from every media outlet in the country wanting his side of the story. By the next morning, the confrontation was the top trending topic on every social media platform, with people split almost exactly down the middle on who was in the right. Some people praised Blake for standing up to Bill's bullying tactics, for defending himself and his fans against someone who'd clearly invited him on the show in bad faith. They said Bill had finally been exposed as the intellectual bully he'd always been, someone who used his platform to attack people who couldn't fight back on equal terms. They pointed to the way Bill had kept escalating, had brought up Blake's personal life, had called security over a harmless poke, as evidence that Bill knew he'd lost the argument and was desperately trying to regain control. Others defended Bill, saying he'd simply asked tough questions that Blake couldn't or wouldn't answer, and that Blake had overreacted because he wasn't used to being challenged. They argued that celebrities needed to be held accountable for their influence, and that Blake's refusal to take clear positions on important issues was itself a problem. They said Blake had gotten aggressive and physical, and that Bill had every right to call security when he felt threatened, regardless of how minor the contact had been. The debate raged for weeks, with both sides pointing to the footage as proof of their position. Television analysts dissected every moment of the confrontation. Body language experts weighed in on who seemed more aggressive, and cultural commentators used it as a jumping-off point to discuss larger issues about celebrity, politics, and media responsibility. The incident became a kind of Rorschach test with people's reactions, revealing more about their own biases and worldviews than about what had actually happened. Bill's show took a ratings hit in the immediate aftermath, with some advertisers pulling their spots and several scheduled guests canceling their appearances. Bill himself remained largely silent, making only a brief statement saying he stood by his interview style and believed in asking difficult questions, but that he regretted how the situation had escalated. He never quite apologized, never admitted any wrongdoing, but the statement was clearly an attempt to move past the controversy. Blake also stayed mostly quiet, letting his representatives handle the media inquiries. He did post one message on social media, thanking his fans for their support and saying he had no regrets about standing up for himself and for them.